Hola, José.
Hello, how are you? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jason. How are you? Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfect. Are you Josefina?
Exactly. Yes, my name, sorry, is as a coordinator here, but yes, it's a pleasure to finally meet you, Jason, after those threads we've been sending to each other. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for being here. And I wanted to introduce to you to Tomas. I think he's there. I don't know if he can hear us.
Yeah,
There,
hello.
Tomas. Hello.
Hi,
it's
Jose. Hi,
good.
Jason.
It's good to meet you.
Hello.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we are delighted to have you. Really, thanks a lot. Hello from Indonesia. I will be here in the background. I leave Josefina to MC, but yeah, really thrilled. Thanks a lot. We have been following your work and sharing it with our students for quite some time, so it's gonna be super meaningful.
Outstanding. Well, I'm glad that I can join in the conversation.
Yes, I think me and Tomas, well, him before me, but because he introduced me your amazing book, one of your amazing books. So we've been a fan for a couple of years. So this moment for us is kind of like we've been expecting for this encounter to happen. Also, the other Tomas connected, Tomas Vivanco, he's the other director
Tomas?
of the program. So
Hello,
yeah,
Jason.
both Tomas
Hello.
we have here.
Perfect.
Yeah, nice to meet you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's my honor.
It's a
I hope
pleasure.
I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Amazing. So Jason, if it's okay with you, we will wait 3 more minutes
Of
in
course.
order for all the students to start connecting. And if it's okay with you, I can do a brief introduction of yourself, and then the room is yours, basically.
Perfect. Why don't we test the share screen? Oh,
Yes.
I'm already enabled. So let me make sure I have the right one. And then we'll just do this and make sure we can get it into presentation mode. Let's see. Sometimes it's a little, the toolbar is sometimes a little bit of a problem, which is here. We're going to fix that. And then we're going to come here. There we go. And here we go. And where is the, there we go. Okay. I have done that. So we will stop the share and we can go back to that when we are ready to talk.
Amazing. Yes, I can see the screen perfectly. So yes, I think students are starting to connect.
So, Jose, if you allow me to use this extra minute we have, I'd love to just share just a couple of notes in relationship to the program, maybe, Jason, how it inserts and in your work, and also why also we find so relevant to to share not only this lecture, but actually during the years, it's kind of one of the mandatory initial lectures is the intro to the book, the history of the world in 7 cheap things. So through the work that we have been doing for quite some time in relationship to democratization of technologies through Fab Labs and maker spaces, we believe that it might be an alternative way in finding, or redesigning a relationship with the planetary resources, right? We understand, like, as you do it very well, that a lot of our current model of production is derived from 500 years of colonization. And what we're trying to do is through existing labs that are actually located in contexts we're trying to create programs, event projects that start to, from the small scale, start to spiraling in gaining momentum and gaining influence to make demonstrations that other ways of producing food, energy, things at the local level is possible, right? So this is the second edition of this program that is a master what we are doing distributedly around the world. So we have students, almost in every corner. And the whole idea is that they, through the work in the program, they're not just not doing an academic program, but they're actually, through the program, they're starting to do things locally or continuing, expanding, scaling up what they have been doing already for quite some time. Actually, we have like a superstars in the program already, So that's a bit of content, of context I wanted to share with you again.
Fantastic.
And yeah, that's I pass it up then to Jose. I think like we can start already,
Yes.
Jose, officially.
Yes, we have many connected for now. So,
Okay.
well, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm gonna start with a brief introduction of Jason, and then he's gonna take the stage for his lecture. So, well, Jason is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he is also a professor of sociology and leads the World Ecology Research Collective. He's an author and editor of several publications that I will share with you in the chat and that I have already shared with you by email. And his books and essays on environmental history, capitalism, and social theory have been widely recognized, and he also coordinates the World Ecology Research Network. So thank you once again, Jason, for accepting our invitation. It is an honor for us to have you, and the stage is yours.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I just want to confirm, you want me to speak for 45 to 50 minutes, less, more?
That would be
Yes.
perfect.
Okay, wonderful. I aim to please. So first we will kick up the PowerPoint and see if we can make it cooperate, which I think we can. And here we go. See if we can get the title to cooperate as well. There we are. So I want to focus on the politics of the climate crisis today. And the key arguments that I will weave together are the following. First, that in order to understand what the climate crisis means, we must be historical. Most of the left, inside and outside the academy, has completely capitulated to the neoliberal mantra first articulated by Francis Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War, that we are at the end of history. And as a consequence, almost all theorizations and political assessments of the climate crisis are removed from its long-term world historical patterns of development over the past 5 centuries. The development of what? Well, of capitalism. And this flight from history fits very well with both mainstream and also left-wing environmentalisms. The idea is that we can talk about living in something called the Anthropocene, the age of man. The first thing that we want to identify about that concept, the age of man, the Anthropocene, is its complete and utter unoriginality. So in the first instance, everything that is referenced about the so-called novelty of the so-called age of man was already identified as the Holocene in the late 19th century. The idea that humanity is a geological actor. Now, of course, and I will get into this a little bit, humanity is not a historical actor. And to speak of man doing things is, in fact, an invention of the very imperial and class forces that have caused the climate crisis. And I say this as a way of orienting us to not just the long-term history of the making of the climate crisis in a materialist sense, but to do so in a properly dialectical and historical materialist sense. We need to understand the long history of ideas and ideologies, foremost among them the trinity of man, nature, and civilization, all in the uppercase. Without engaging these long-term material and ideological histories in the making of the climate crisis, we are left with a dominant conception of planetary justice that is, in fact, not liberatory at all, but veils and facilitates a transitionary program to deal with the climate crisis from above. That's a program that I call planetary managerialism, and it represents a move from what I call the flat Earth climate denialism of previous decades to a softer and more sophisticated form of denialism that takes the form of emphasizing consumerism, bad markets, greedy corporations, rather than capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life. I understand you have read some of my work and some of the essays on cheap nature, and this is the fundamental logic of cheap nature, which is not only cheap in price, but a geocultural project of devaluation, centering on Prometheanism, capitalist domination of something it calls nature, which is in turn intimately joined to climate apartheid and climate patriarchy in a very long history of capitalism and the making of climate crisis. So we have to wrap the ideological and material moments of the climate crisis in a long run historical perspective. And I'll run through why that gives us an ecology of hope rather than the ecology of doom, which is perpetrated not just by the media industrial complex, the propaganda apparatus of late capitalism, but also by many academics. And it's increasingly clear that, yes, we are exiting something called the Holocene, a long 11,700 years, more or less, period of unusual climate stability. That, it turns out, is not an accident, and it does not mean that we are living in the era, finally, when man, in scare quotes, and I use the old-fashioned language deliberately, when man is becoming a geological force. Well, part of the neoliberal counter-revolution is on the environmentalist terrain is the Anthropocene. And we can see many different renderings of this, but in essence, this recycles an older ideological trope from second wave environmentalism that emerges around the time of the first Earth Day in 1970 and goes back even farther, even deeper in history to the civilizing project of capitalist empires from the Iberians all the way through to Truman's Point 4 developmentalism announced in 1949 to, yes, sustainable development from the great petro-state Prime Minister Gro Brundtland. And its message is always the same, that there is an eternal conflict between man and nature. The eternal conflict must be managed, mediated, either for the better or for the worse, by social institutions called civilization. Today, we don't say that, we say society, because civilization sounds old-fashioned. But again, this was the very language of power, of ideology, of imperialism from the beginning of modernity. This is how the English spoke about it in learning how to be such brutal imperialists on the island of Ireland. And this is also how the Iberians organized their mode of thought appropriate to the imperialist genocides and labor mobilizations of the 16th and 17th century. For instance, one of the great linguistic, which is also an ideological and cultural transformations of the age of genocide in this period, was the reduction of indigenous peoples to naturales. And naturales itself, the word, went through a mighty and rapid transformation from meaning, of course, the inhabitant of a town to part of nature. So this gives us a sense very early on in this lecture that one of the colossal epoch-making ideological achievements of the modern world is to hide from view that the category of man or the human was wrapped up in the practical, cultural, and material, geographical, social displacements and expulsions of the vast majority of humans from the realm of the human. That is, indigenous peoples, Celts, Slavs, virtually all women, virtually all peasants, Africans, and so on and so forth. And so this imaginary of man versus nature, only to be exacerbated or attenuated, the conflict attenuated by civilization, feeds into climate doom and then into its mirror image, which is the insane and absurd notion that the very social relations that created the crisis will serve to save it. And this discourse is usually, almost always, and overwhelmingly pitched in the language of scientism and technology. And so you will hear me talk, and I've written about something called good science, G with an uppercase G and S, and good science, which is the ideological extraction of bourgeois science. Now, bourgeois science itself is not in all cases bad. This is the long history of scientific revolution from the 16th century onwards. But let's be clear that bourgeois science, modern science, was never cooked up in some lab apart from the relations of power, profit, and life and capitalism. Science was always absorbing the zeitgeist, the fundamental assumptions of an emergent capitalist order. The greatest example with which we are all familiar is Malthus and populationism, which masquerades as science, as mathematical reason, and is anything but. And we'll come back to Malthusianism because it turns out it's about more than just population. And so when we are told it is, and when we believe it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, we are falling prey to the ideological con job, the deception, the fraudulent arguments of those who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, or who the Economist magazine later called the masters of the universe. For instance, those who gather at the Alpine ski resort in Switzerland every year in Davos to cook up plans for a post-capitalist climate transition under the sign of the Great Reset. So if we are saying goodbye to the Holocene, what next? Well, the Capitalocene is not a geological concept. It is a geohistorical concept that takes geology and geobiology very, very seriously. And this is part of the argument of the world ecology conversation. And it points out uncomfortable facts, such as, for instance, that the geological sciences from the late 19th century are arguably the domain of the natural sciences most closely, immediately, and proximately connected to imperialism and its economic motives. Of course, the point of geology as an actually existing science is economic geography, to locate the natural gas, petroleum, and other mineral reserves that can underwrite and enable the endless accumulation of capital. What the world ecology conversation insists upon is that we think through every one of our theoretical and conceptual frameworks through history. We ground them in history. What is important is that we understand what happened. And that is true if we are trying to understand what happened 50,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 550, 5 years ago, 5 minutes ago. All of us are creatures of historical process. We are not narrowly determined. We have choice, but our choices themselves are framed by ideologies and life experiences that are deeply contradictory in a dialectical sense. And so for Marx and Engels, one of the essences of history is a labor ontology, a labor theory of life that highlights the praxis, not just of physical activity, but crucially of consciousness mixed with the work of planetary life. And so the only way that we can make sense of the climate today is by identifying its origins, by identifying its patterns of development, its contradictions. And from there, we can begin to assess what is new about the present moment. Why do we need to assess what's new about the present moment? Because we need to assess and identify what Lenin once called the weak links in the imperialist and capitalist chains of power. Because we all understand that business as usual, politics as usual will not suffice in the present moment. So the capitalistine argument insists that the origins and development of climate crisis flow from capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life. Now, we've all become familiar with discussions and news reports to this effect, highlighting the profound climate inequality and differential responsibility. The capitalistine argument goes deeper, but it's worth flagging this, that we know, for instance, this is from a few years ago, that the world's 8 billionaires hold more wealth than the bottom 3.6 billion or so. We understand that a very narrow band of transnational corporations is overwhelmingly responsible. I think Richard Heath's work on carbon majors, where he identifies something like 70% of world carbon emissions flow from just 70. It's a flow from a specific number, which escapes me at the moment, of transnational corporations. And of course, we've just been treated to the latest Oxfam report, which is deeply necessary and also profoundly misleading, because the problem is not differential consumption. The problem is what World Ecology identifies through cheap nature and other arguments, that the climate crisis is the outcome of a class struggle in the web of life. And this has to be understood in a dialectical and evocative way. I'll tease out some dimensions of that. But we want to link what Oxfam refuses to link, which is that distributions of income and wealth are not the same as class divides. So, for instance, a working class family in the United States would probably almost certainly be within the top 10% of the income bracket, but is utterly excluded from a political system that is run by an oligarchy with totalitarian inclinations. The reason why I put these two moments together is because one of the greatest failures of the Anthropocene dialogue and of those on the left who are talking about it is the refusal to understand that the deepening of the climate crisis, the deepening of the climate class divide, has also set in motion a long era of permanent war. For example, of over 500 foreign military interventions conducted by the United States in its entire history, this is according to Tufts University, over 1/3 of those interventions have occurred since 1999. As we've seen in the recent NATO-Russia conflict in Ukraine, Greens are amongst the greatest warmongers, of course, cheerleading for the greatest rearmament of Germany since the 1930s and denouncing Slavs as subhumans. Just go and look at the language of Florenz Gaub if you doubt what I'm saying. So for us, when we say that the climate crisis is not anthropogenic, we say something quite obvious, not only is a reality that the responsibility for the climate change is spread unevenly across humankind. Humankind is not even the right way to think about it. It's a fetish. It's an ideological achievement of imperialism. And that humankind does not make history. Corporations make history. Empires make history. Financial markets make history. Political parties make history. Human beings, as an abstract category, do not make history. So we identify, yes, there is differential responsibility, and we proceed to implicate the class divide and the class struggle in the web of life. This matters quite a bit for our politics, and it matters quite a bit for the historical assessments that we make of the development of the politics. So as I've been saying for many years, if we start the clock with the steam engine, the rotary steam engine in the 1780s, more or less, this is what the Anthropocene argument, and also what many Marxists argue as well, then we have an entirely different political assessment than if we understand that the origins of capitalism, the origins of the plantation system, the greatest geobiological tipping point in human history following the invasions of 1492, we have a very different set of politics. And it's not that the transformations of the so-called Industrial Revolution are unimportant. They are important. They are simply not the origins. And if we want to understand how capitalism fixes its crises, we can indeed go to look at the Industrial Revolution. And here's the punchline. The Industrial Revolution does not locate its prime mechanical machine with the steam engine. It's the cotton gin in the American South, the reconstruction of a new era of plantation slavery. In that era, the greatest bottleneck to so-called industrialization had nothing to do with energy sources. It had everything to do with cheap cotton, specifically the kinds of cheap cotton grown and harvested in the American South. So when we are beginning to ask questions about climate justice and climate crisis, we always need to return to this longer history. We all need to be world historians up to a point. And this is true regardless of the field of inquiry and the field of practice that we locate ourselves within. This is not a question for philosophers or historians any more than it is for chemists and biologists and architects and designers of all sorts and artists of every kind. We need to begin to look at the origins ideologically, materially, politically, environmentally of this crisis. Why? Because we need to go to the roots of the problem. And the roots of the problem are not bad technology or too many people or inefficient markets or greedy corporations. The roots of the problem are a dynamic of capital accumulation enforced by empire and its geocultural projects, especially of racism, sexism, and Prometheanism, an abstracted domination of capital over all webs of life. So this is part of the answer to the question, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism? It goes back to, as I've hinted, the origins of capitalism in the decades and centuries immediately before and after 1492. And here there was the gradual emergence of forms of domination that were politically and culturally necessary to consolidate a regime of endless capital accumulation. Make no mistake about it, this is not a question of abstract growth, and I have many comrades who are in the degrowth movement, and I respect and admire their arguments, but this is not a problem of growth, and growth is a fetish. Growth is a specific intellectual invention whose lineage can be traced back proximately to John Maynard Keynes working in the India Home Office just after World War I, and then growth accounting, national economic accounting, becomes embedded within the post-World War II developmentalist project. Growth is a fetish. There's this great English expression, garbage in, garbage out. So if you put bad data into an analysis, you're going to get bad results. If you put a fetish into an argument, you're going to get a result that might be useful, but is deeply flawed by fetishes. Other fetishes, even more significant, are those of man, nature, and civilization. And here in this diagram, we're beginning to see that this was not an innocent dualism. It was very much the geocultural expression of what Marx calls primitive accumulation, the separation of the direct producers and reproducers from access to the means of production. Specifically, in Marx's account, the separation from the land and the subsequent long proletarianization that follows. Well, that was a class dynamic, and this is the cultural expression of that class dynamic on the land. It takes many forms. It doesn't always, as Marx insisted, it doesn't always resemble the form that it takes in Capital, in that last great moment of Capital. So that was the origins of this origins of capitalism. The origins of capitalogenic climate change are located in those centuries after 1492. Don't worry, we'll have an opportunity to revisit that. But if we move from that era, in which for the first time in the era of Columbus, there was, thanks to the emergent technologies of cartography, a mapping of the entire planet. And if you want to find the decisive technologies of capitalist power, profit, and life, don't go and look for the combustion engine or the steam engine. Go and look for the mechanical clock and the cartographic revolution, along with the quantitative and mathematical revolutions of the 15th, 16th centuries. That allowed for a new dominant hegemonic imaginary of planetary space, what I have called elsewhere the Promethean gaze, and you can find that in other essays on my website. And this is, for those who have seen it, but maybe it hasn't quite registered, this is the Earthrise photograph, usually described as the most influential photograph ever taken, snapped from Apollo 8's orbit on Christmas Eve, 1968. It is usually paired with the blue marble photograph. And the connection with this era of violence, genocide, and the end of the world for 95% of American indigenous peoples, the connection between this era and this is that this photograph is literally taken from the infrastructure of nuclear war. That's what the space program was about. It was about ensuring that the United States could launch and survive a first strike nuclear war. And in that era, in that post-World War II era, we saw incubating almost from the very first moments from 1948, when William Voigt and Mr. Osborne, whose name I'm forgetting, published our Road to Survival and Our Plundered, The Road to Survival and Our Plundered Planet. Almost from the very beginning of the post-World War II era, we had a popularization of a new form of the Malthusian imaginary, of environmental Malthusianism. For now, the basic point that I want to underscore is that the beating heart of Malthus's vision is not about population as such. In fact, he never uses in either of his two essays the word overpopulation. He talks about population becoming overcharged. But the great ideological innovation of Malthus is to invoke natural law to justify capitalist inequality. And that indeed was the reality of England in the second half of the 18th century. Malthus was writing in a time of unprecedented social revolution and social revolt, not just the French Revolution, but also the Haitian Revolution, the Irish Revolt in the 1790s, the British Navy mutinies in right in the years around 1798. There is this era of profound ferment. Malthus is intent on using natural law, an ahistorical and anti-historical concept of nature, to justify rich and poor. And thus he says in one of the most famous passages of the essay on population that the state should provide no right to subsistence. The right to helping the poor only makes the problem worse. And this is his famous discussion of nature's mighty feast. Now, what's not understood about Malthus's era and about other eras is that Malthus's moment was a period of exceptionally unfavorable climate and a very brief but very, very intense downturn in the climate conditions of the Little Ice Age. And one of the questions I often ask is, why is it that these eras of unfavorable climate change, which in Western Europe mostly means very cold and then rainy seasons that come either too early, too late, and or are torrential and destroy fragile grain crops, that why is it that these moments of unfavorable climate change are also moments of popular revolt, and even, as is the case in the 5th century, and then again in the 14th century, moments of epochal civilizational crisis? And the short answer is that ruling classes are especially vulnerable in terms of the underlying sources of their class power to unfavorable climate changes. Now, the story looks different in different parts of the world. So famously, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, survives. Its dominant response to its dominant climate changes were those of drought, which is still severe, but more manageable than the conditions of, for instance, Western Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries. What happened was an extraordinary moment of the epochal crisis of Western Rome, the destruction of the greatest slaveholding society in human history, and the emergence for several centuries of a peasant mode of production, which was egalitarian and which raised the living standards for the vast majority. A similar but attenuated story occurs during the long 14th century crisis of feudalism. Yes, in the very short run, there are very severe impacts on the vast majority. The Black Death as a narrative is installed in our memories as a Malthusian story. It is not a Malthusian story. We can get into why that is. But what happened through these convergence, not a convergence, but an interweaving rather of climate, class, disease, and other socio-ecological relations was that ruling class power was weakened in late feudal Europe and peasant and worker power was strengthened. This set the stage for the crisis of feudalism, the inability of feudal ruling classes to restore feudalism, and ultimately the drive across the Atlantic that leads to the rise of capitalism. Right, all of that is very, very important to keep in mind as we try to make sense then of environmentalist politics over the past half century, which is very much premised on the internalization of an imperialist logic and is very much committed to telling us, whatever we do, please don't name the system. Please don't identify capitalism and the class and accumulation dynamics of capitalism. Whatever you do, make sure that you frame the problem of crisis in terms of the eternal conflict between man and nature. All of this comes together in the years immediately following 1968 and the publication of Paul and Ann Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. The modern environmental imaginary, let me underscore, is not a social movement, does not come out of a social movement in any meaningful sense of that term. There are subsequent local and regional movements all around the world that unfold, I think, more appropriately under the banner of environmental justice. But the emergence of environmentalism after 1968 is not a social movement story. It is a story of a popular mobilization stirred up by the media industrial complex and key elements of the political establishment in this period, culminating in the first Earth Day. And you know it wasn't a real social movement because social movements name the system. Social movements have enemies. What was the mantra? And you can see it on the screen here. This is the famous Pogo cartoon that was arguably the iconic visualization of the first Earth Day in 1970, Pogo's Lament. We have met the enemy and he is us. This was not incidental. The cartoonist Walt Kelly and the cartoon strip Pogo was the first or second most widely read cartoon in the post-war United States. Well, what happens right after the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970? Already, it seems Nixon had given the order for the invasion of Laos and Cambodia. 1 week to the day after the first Earth Day, American and South Vietnamese units roll over across the border into Laos and Cambodia. This was a horrific war crime. And just to put too fine a point on it, perhaps if you're not familiar with the history, it was this invasion that sets the stage for Pol Pot's ascendance in Cambodia over the next few years. This was absolutely brutal. And the Earth Day infrastructure, which had mobilized 20 million people just a week before, did nothing. And this is a continual feature of environmentalist, mainstream environmentalist politics ever since. Either the silence of environmentalism on questions of war and peace, or its active cheerleading for war machines, as is the case with, famously, the German Green Party. And what we want to do is to begin to try to make sense of the mantra, not just of we have met the enemy and he is us, but at the same time of this doomist imaginary. And the doomist imaginary of environmentalism is inherited from America's nuclear hegemony after World War II. Here you can see Wernher von Braun, the former Nazi rocket scientist, now employed by NASA and appearing on the Disney weekly television show in the mid-1950s, I think from 1954. If this looks familiar, it's the double version of this spaceship that Wernher von Braun is standing in front of is the spaceship that appears in the movie 2001. And here's the other part of it, that Wernher von Braun first proposes this as a nuclear weapons delivery device right around 1950 to 51. On the right, you can see an American map of the Soviet Union in preparation for a first strike nuclear attack in 1954. This is crucial to the formation of the modern environmental imaginary. So if you're familiar, broadly speaking, with planetary boundaries discussions or natural limits discussions or degrowth even, and again, I have many comrades in degrowth, but you have to look at where these ideas come from and their ideological lineages, that this post-war nuclear hegemonic project of the United States incubated systems dynamics and eventually, and by eventually I mean within about 15 to 20 years, germinated the World 3 model used by Donella and Dennis Meadows and their team in Limits to Growth. The model was cooked up by a fellow named Jay Forrester, whose name should be familiar to every environmentalist and isn't. Jay Forrester was the father of modern systems dynamics, and yes, and basically developed these models first in constructing a North American air defense system, again, in relation to America's first strike nuclear ambitions, and then began to use these models as managerial models for the workplace, for the battlefield, and then for the management of nature, planetary management. And so here you can see the confluence of elements of Jay Forrester's Whirlwind project and his SAGE project, which was this North American air defense system, with the cybernetics modeling, systems dynamic model of the 60s, and then again maps for nuclear first strikes in the Soviet Union. So this was, of course, a plan for the end of the world for a significant part of the population that mirrors and expresses the same dynamics of militarized accumulation and the imperialist management of so-called resources, including human beings and their capacity to work, that goes back to the very origins. There is a story that holds that the genocides of the New World were not genocides. They were biological accidents. Whoops, the diseases, the microbes hitched a ride on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and the other vessels that carried soldiers and guns and planters and priests to the New World. This is not true. That there would have, yes, indeed, been colossal loss of life regardless, but somewhere in the ballpark of 30%, not 95%. We know this because the flashpoints of genocide were indeed the flashpoints of labor mobilization. You can see this, that colonial Peru, where the great silver mines of Potosí were located, is one flashpoint. Northeastern Brazil, where the great sugar plantation revolution of the 16th and early 17th century occurred, that was another. The Valley of Mexico, and it's linked to all sorts of manufacturing, silver mining, stock raising, commercial activities. That was another. So we can very clearly identify those connections. What I want to underscore is, and by the way, this led to, or contributed to, I should say, contributed in part, the genocides of the New World contributed to the great climate crisis of what's called the long, cold 17th century, this period between 1550 and 1700, that was the formative era of the capitalist world ecology. It was also the coldest period of the past 8,000 years. Those go together because it was also a moment of extraordinary economic crisis and popular revolt that had to be managed. And it was managed. And what was different from the 17th century compared to the 14th century, compared to the crisis of the Roman West in the 5th century, is that the imperialism and capitalism of this period had the technological capacities to move to the frontiers of the tropical and subtropical world and establish new productive zones and new bases for the capitalist mode of production. This was, again, the story in the era of Malthus. So let's just remember, Malthus is a little Ice Age thinker. There is a climate class divide in this moment. What Malthus is arguing during a period of crisis for capitalism is that natural law explains the realities of capitalism, not enclosure, not imperialist war, not class exploitation, but nature. And that's a recurrent phrase when we hear discussions about climate crisis. The climate crisis is an existential crisis. When we hear about how it is going to doom us all, well, those are arguments deeply rooted and incubated across centuries of capitalism, not just as a mode of production, but as a mode of thought, as a mode of culture. And here's the big takeaway that I want to make, is that historically, moments of unfavorable climate change are moments of very serious crisis within civilizations, world ecologies, modes of production. Either developmentalist crises that can be overcome, or, as with the crisis of the Roman West in the 5th century, the crisis of the feudal mode of production in the long 14th century, they can be an epochal crisis. And I used to give talks where I said, well, you know, it's an open question. Are we in the midst of a developmentalist crisis that can be overcome, or an epochal crisis? But the answer, frankly, is completely obvious. And it would be dishonest of me to pose the question as if my mind is not made up. very, very clearly, we can identify the very concrete, specific, definite mechanisms of fixing capitalism's crises over the past 5 centuries, especially, but not limited to, those moments of unfavorable climate crisis. And the essential model is this: move to frontiers of uncapitalized nature, of human nature, of extra-human nature, that will set loose massive volumes of what I call the 4 chiefs: labor, energy, food, and raw materials. They are all connected, by the way. And labor is the most central of those, but you need all of them to propel new waves of capital accumulation. There are no frontiers today that are capable of issuing a new era of cheap nature. Nevertheless, what is happening is that the old strategies of permanent war, of primitive accumulation, militarized accumulation, all the rest are still in place. But the underlying sources of vitality that historically those mechanisms of capital and imperialism were able to secure, those new sources of cheap nature no longer exist, but the strategy and the logic of cheap nature exists. That's why I call the present moment of capitalism zombie capitalism. It's dead inside, but it's moving around and it's deadly. That claim is premised on 25 years of investigating the precise and specific mechanisms through which capitalism revives, restructures, and renews itself. It's not a metaphysic. It's not saying, well, there's going to be a technological fix, there's going to be a cultural fix. No. So the implication of this goes to a question that Samir Amin sometimes posed in his life. Samir Amin, the great anti-imperialist Marxist of the post-World War II era, he said, look, there are 2 basic outcomes to an epochal crisis of a mode of production. One is a revolutionary outcome, and that's basically hypothetical. That is, it embodies a revolution from below. It represents a fundamental democratic transition. And that's strictly hypothetical, although we see elements of a revolutionary transition in the rise of a peasant mode of production in Western Europe following the crisis of the Roman West, in the thick of the Dark Ages cold period. We see elements of it in the crisis of feudalism. And indeed, some of those reverberations continued across the early centuries of capitalism with communist and millenarian movements like the Anabaptists, or later diggers and levelers in the aftermath of the English Revolution, which was also a moment of climate crisis. There have been elements of it, of the Soviet experience, of the Chinese experience, etc. There are elements of that. But the revolutionary possibility is contrasted for Samir Amin with decadent transitions. That is, transitions where the ruling class reinvents itself into a new mode of production. And this is a rough and ready description of what happens in late feudal Europe in the 14th, 15th, and early 16th centuries, as various seigneurial and territorialist forces, mercantile forces, begin to work together, not consciously, but work together nevertheless to find a new way to expand the economic surplus after their historic defeat in the class struggles of the urban and rural landscapes of that era. So there are these 2 options, and they are very much with us today. The more revolutionary elements of a climate justice and socialist movement seek to build socialism as a transition, as a democratic and sustainable model. But there's also clear projects for a transition from above, of which 2 deserve special note. One is that of a transnational bourgeoisie linked with transnational elements of capital, like the Bilderberg Group in Western Europe, like the Davos Forum, the World Economic Forum, but also aligned very, very closely with the Pentagon, White House, Wall Street nexus, And then, of course, on the other side is Belt and Road. Both of those are visions for dealing with the climate crisis from above in distinctive ways. So I don't want to create a false equivalence, but in distinctive ways. So what this does, and I'm just going to zip through to so we have lots of time in for the rest of our talk. What I'm trying to say is that instead of climate doom, we want to understand the major climate crises. Here's a map of what happens around the era of the Bronze Age crisis, which is clearly influenced in major ways by a drought period that is linked to a shift in the North Atlantic Oscillation. That these moments of unfavorable climate crisis are not climate determinisms, but have an impact on every element, and obviously, most obviously, the agrarian element of civilizations. And that climate is woven into the socio-ecological DNA of a particular class structure. Now, with capitalism, we know this very clearly, that climate change has already induced massive yield suppression on agricultural productivity. That doesn't spell famine, but it spells social crisis, because the price of food and the price of labor are intimately connected. And that is one of the weakest links. Lenin speaks of weak links. So that is one of the weakest links in the chains of political stability. As we know, that periods of food price spike are periods of profound social volatility. That's not a new development. And so let's just keep in mind, as we head into a discussion of climate politics, of climate justice, and what is to be done, that we can take hope from this long history of climate crises and social revolts and epochal crises. That an epochal crisis can be, in principle, very good or very bad, but without the historical sensibility, it will never be anything but bad. And I think I want to end there to allow for a lot of time around our discussions.
Amazing. Thank you, Jason. So yes, let's open the space for Q&A. Who wants to start?
I can go to warm up. And thank you very much, Jason. Of course, I think you drop a few bombs and very good takeaways. I mean, there are things that of course I can identify also with you know, in a way, like a political position, right, in relationship to where is the source of this problem. I pretty much I think, like, I resonate quite a lot on trying to understand that, you know, the narrative on putting the problem into civilization itself is kind of a quite perverse, and then actually it's like at the, you know, the structural powers that are behind, but actually that whole civilization are the ones that you can blame, let's say, quote unquote. But the truth is, like, those are the ones that hold civilization itself. And again, like, just for context, because they can easily, you can like see like your shift. I can shift to the left or the right, and just for context, I was born and raised in Venezuela, right? Like, we had a very bad socialist government. That's also when I say, like, one of the options is going to at any type of socialism. For some of us, it's like, hey, wait a second, this is proven not to work in certain contexts, right? But I'm not like let's say like a free market. Let's leave it to the market to resolve it, because it's gonna, you know, markets profits are gonna thrive in innovation. So we're trying to figure out where is actually the opportunities of intervention. Actually, what we do here in this program is to understand design, not as a form of creating, you know, a magic object and say, okay, this is gonna solve the problem, but actually design as a process in which you actually insert yourself into the problem in a small scale and trying to figure it out, because the problem changes also, right? And then it's evolving, it's in constant evolution, no? So it's like this permanent kind of a search for how to resolve the issue, because the other thing is like you know, in history, what I like also very much that you put is like every designer, every architect, and I share this like 100%. We need to look at where these problems come from, no? So I don't know if I'm gonna lead to a question, but like you were saying, like, you know, like one of the options is to get out of this is to get in some form of like a socialism, but like a role by who, no? Because we're proving like just as evil as corporation is also the political power. Power corrupts people, and to be honest, like I come from a very traumatic socialist implementation of or form of government with a lot of hope at the beginning. I was a strong supporter of Chavez. I was in Cuba. I was, I was part of programs in between governments, and it didn't work. And on the other hand, we see that the alternative is like, leave it all to Elon Musk. It's not going to work either, right? So my question is like, is there a third way? No, there's always like, where's the third path? And then my second question is like, also, have you considered also to add a fifth cheap thing? And now like, it seems like to be algorithms, right? Like cheap algorithms, which actually relate quite deeply with everything else at the end, no? Because you need energy to power the computers, you need labor to build them, you need the natural resources, etc. But kind of creating like a more complex layer on top. Yeah, that's it.
It's a great question. Well, let's leave aside the question of Venezuela, because I don't think we're going to disagree. I don't think we're going to agree on what worked and what didn't work. I think it's, but let's look at a question like the extraordinary achievement of the Soviet Union after the defeat of Nazism, which was done 90% by the Red Army. After that, the Germans, of course, had destroyed physically and materially the totality of European Russia, and proceeded to engage in the greatest housing construction campaign in human history. We can all have different assessments of the aesthetic beauty of the Khrushchevka, but let's look at the construction of just in the 1950s of housing 20 to 30 million people in apartments with electricity, with running water, located nearby schools, healthcare sites, etc. That this was an extraordinary achievement in human history. And one intimately related to design. There's a great story. Khrushchev goes to Leningrad to look at the provisional designs. And if you don't know what the Khrushchevkas are, you've probably seen them. They're these 5-story, simple prefabricated buildings that were designed to provide modern housing for people who were living in bunkhouses, in large barns, without running water, without electricity. They were designed to build housing as fast as humanly possible for a population that had been subjected to the Nazi war machine and the deaths of 28 million human beings in Soviet peoples in European Russia. And so Khrushchev comes and he says, no, you have to make it simpler. And so God may be in the details, and I agree with that for beautiful architecture. And there's something just fantastically extraordinary about what the Soviet project was able to do in its housing campaigns, of course, succeeded by the Brezhnevkas and by many other infrastructural and housing campaigns. Was it contradictory? Yeah, sure. History is not a fairy tale. So that's not an endorsement of one or another model. There's one group of human beings who is absolutely certain that socialism works, which is the world's bourgeoisie. They know socialism will work. That's why they never allow it to work. That's why they subordinate Venezuela included to counter-revolution, soft power, hard power, sanctions, everything else. This is not a Venezuela-specific story, but the U.S. knew it could work and refused to allow it. Cuba is another example. The number of military interventions across Latin America over the past 50, 60 years is more than we can count. So there's one group that's absolutely certain that socialism will work. Now, and we can get into this more. Now, for AI, cheap data is not an invention, and the algorithmic capitalism is a new technical facility in some ways, but really goes back to the origins of capitalism and the quantitative revolution. You can think of not just double entry bookkeeping and the mathematical revolutions, especially geometric revolutions, in thought of the Renaissance reappearance of Euclidean geometry, the emergence of Renaissance perspective in painting, which was intimately connected not only to the cartographic revolution, but also to the geometric calculations used to build artillery. See how all this connects? So there is this longer history of capitalism as a mode of thought. I've written quite a bit about this recently. There's an essay that I mentioned about the Promethean gaze, but also across my books, Capitalism and the Web of Life, and many other texts on the capitalist scene, I point out that there is a kind of quantitative mathematical source code that then is used in various technical facilities across the long arc of capitalism, going all the way to the algorithmic revolution, which, of course, and it's a great question for precisely this reason, of course, it links to the earlier cybernetics revolution. And then you have in the early 1970s, Black-Scholes, the financial risk assessment algorithm, and then other forms of algorithmic capitalism that mark a reinvention of this. Ultimately, these are forms of management. These are management technologies for managing risk, but also with algorithms for the great leap forward in the totalitarian aspirations of centrist liberalism and the fear that a free flow of information will lead people to become dangerous and ask dangerous questions. So a great example of this is the tight links between the American national security state and platform capitalists like, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. This all came out with the Twitter files. So this is not another condition for the renewal of capital accumulation so much as an elaboration of new forms of mathematical, quantitative, algorithmic knowledge that have a very deep history. It's a fantastic question.
Thank you. And just one clarification. Again, like I come from, and I won't go deeper into the Venezuela, because Venezuela, as many other places, can end in an endless conversation. But we have Tomás is from Chile also, no, and like and the coup d'état that in 2001 Chavez received was like a copy of the Allende coup d'état that happened 50 years earlier, right? So it's like a disinterventionism of America. In Latin America, it's something that we grew up with and we understand very deeply. But also, on the other hand, we also lived one of the most prosperous, government capitalism. Let's say Chavez managed to create so much wealth and so much capital accumulation in the government. At the same time, after he defeated all his enemies, and then afterwards it got like a deeply corrupted. It's a really, really interesting story, because he kind of shifted from all the extremes of all the palettes, no, from one extreme to the other, and extreme, and to be honest, we're still trying to figure out what didn't work, why it didn't work, and also the question as well is like, okay, now seeing also that everything, one of the things that happened to nowadays as well is like this kind of what you call it, like a dualism, no? It's like a one stream of the other, but like where is one, there are things that we can rescue. That's what I was saying. Even the Chavez government we were proposing itself like the third way, and actually became in one extreme, and then it became in the other extreme, and then it ended up in something that they don't know even what it is.
And I completely see where you're going. So let's be aware that in the Anglophonic world, and that's not the entire world, and I'm fully aware of that, in the Anglophonic world, third way is indelibly linked to the right-wing neoliberal policies of Blair's New Labour in the UK and Clinton's Democratic Party in the USA, and the specific remilitarization and aggressive use of military power against the global south. The third way tended in the final analysis to be the old way. Now, there's a longer lineage to that expression, which goes back to liberals and social democrats supporting imperial anti-communism, especially in the Vietnam War era, and supporting right-wing oligarchs all around the world in the name of the enemy is my enemy is my friend. And so in the Anglophonic world, it has a very specific historical meaning. Other questions?
Thank
That's
you.
a fantastic start
Yes,
to our conversation.
I would like because as Thomas mentioned, I'm from Chile also, and I have like not similar, but in the same line that Thomas comment question, right? Here in Chile, under the Salvador Allende's government in the early 70s, there was kind of an attempt to build, I don't know if it's called the third way or maybe, but this was a new way in which cybernetics played a key role with the project, the CyberSyn project. I don't know if you are familiar with it, in which Gibbon Siepe from the Bauhaus came from Germany to Chile to participate and to redesign this, let's say, system that was an interconnected system that had a part of an infrastructure, then the minimum viable system from start for build, then a cyber strike, and so on and so forth. So there were some ideas in between, I think, or that came from cybernetics, and specifically from biologists like Humberto Maturana, that in which he invented, let's say, the term autopoiesis, in which it was an open process of a self-regulatory system, right? In which it was, which combined somehow what the people, the people initiatives, a social movement, and also politics. So how do you see the role of cybernetics as a regulatory system in this idea of building a new way? And also from a design perspective, and maybe this is too close to Jonathan Friedman's idea, but or definition of utopias, but which is the role, let's say, of utopias as a design process. Understanding that utopia, first you have to somehow detect an issue, a problem, then to identify, let's say, a tool or technology that is available, and then a third, that I think that is the most important part, that is to create consensus in between the society in order to address the issue with the given technology. So how do you see, on one hand, cybernetics as a regulatory system of this, and then this attitude of designing under utopias?
Those are fantastic questions. First of all, you're quite correct that the popular unity brings in a cybernetics, actually, complex interlinked computing systems to specifically address the counter-revolutionary sabotage of supply chains in Chile. So the first thing that needs to be distinguished is there's a bourgeois and imperialist cybernetics, and that's associated with characters like J. Forrester. Norbert Wiener, who of course is often credited, he's not the only one, but Norbert Wiener's classic text from the late 40s is a contradictory one. And Wiener realized immediately after publishing, oh my God, what have I done here? Because he saw very clearly the bourgeois and imperial character of cybernetics. So there's an imperialist and bourgeois cybernetics. There's also various proletarian alternatives. And I don't know that I would put Maturana and Varela in there, but they've been huge influences on me, as I think you know. I disagree with them over the matter of dialectics. I think, yes, indeed, there is an unbroken flow of being, doing, and thinking. That's there. It's also a dialectical process that they are not able to go as far as I would like to see. And before Maturana and Varela, of course, there's Bogdanov and techtology. So there's and the prolet cult movement, proletarian culture movement associated with Bogdanov. And so I think part of the task of the present to understand the possibilities for If you don't like socialism, let's call it democratic and egalitarian and worker-centered transition. The possibilities are of those ways of thinking of a dialectical cybernetics are indeed real and possible. Now, here's the problem with utopia, especially if you're in design, that utopia means nowhere. And if you're designing someplace, it's always something, it's always in some place. And in periods of profound working class defeat, of the long defeat of the world proletariat, such as we've seen across the past half century, and this is not unusual in the history of capitalism. This was the case for the world proletariat, roughly in the period between the 1820s and the 1870s. That in such periods, critical intellectuals like to take refuge in a utopia that's disconnected from the actual geohistorical development of capitalism in the web of life. And we need to connect those two dynamics. Yes, there needs to be a utopian imagination, and we need a praxis and strategy for how we get from here to there. Here's the thing about the ruling classes, and the bourgeoisie is a decadent ruling class, but is also the smartest ruling class history has ever known. You can't sneak up on them. They're not going to be fooled by plans to take away their wealth and power. They are always going to see it coming. They saw it coming in Allende's Chile, and the result was violent counter-revolution. At different times, that's the norm across what we then called the third world, what we now call the global south. That's the normal pattern whenever revolutionary movements seem to gain real traction. But it's not limited to that kind of phenomenon. Go and Google, if you will, what is called Britain's Watergate. So Watergate after the famous political controversy involving President Nixon in the United States. And this was in the aftermath of the second Wilson Labor government and their election in February 1974, on the strength of the most radical proletarian political program of Western Europe in the 20th century, even more than popular unity in France in 1930s, before Allende's popular unity. And there was, as is widely agreed, a soft coup conducted by the MI5, MI6, the IMF, the CIA, elements of the British military, all of whom conspired to impose a soft coup and the neoliberal realignment and reshuffling of the left-wing Wilson government. So this is not something that, the revolution is not something that will can be done incrementally. You can do experiments that are vital, that are necessary for the kinds of prefigurative imaginations that a socialist transition will require. And I am fully on board with all manner of anarchist and other experiments. But how to get from here to there? Let's be aware that the bourgeoisie is not going to sit peacefully while their wealth and power is democratized. As you know from the history of Latin America, amongst many other places in the world.
We are seeing it right now with a left-wing government right now that has been economically stopped, let's say.
Precisely.
Yeah, precisely.
Danny, if you want to go ahead with your question.
Hi, hello.
Hi, Danny.
Not about history, but I'd like to ask your opinion about future when we have to face climate crisis and we communicate among each other in a different way today than it was before. We can communicate analog and digital at the same time. Is a digital communication a positive thing or not, in your opinion?
So say your question again.
As the digital communication that we have now, so flow of information or misinformation, a good thing?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Was a good thing? It's a good thing. It's gonna help, or it might not help. It might delay any action we could do collectively to help ourselves.
Well, the free flow of ideas and information is always a good thing. Unfortunately, we live at a moment where centrist liberalism, so this is not, or not only, or not always right-wing populism, but centrist liberalism across the imperialist countries is deeply committed to the suppression of free speech, to banning or shadow banning of various figures on YouTube, on Instagram, on X or Twitter. In fact, I was just hearing a United States senator bemoaning the fact that they cannot censor or influence TikTok because it's China owned, and TikTok is one of the places where voices critical of the Israeli war machine can be heard, especially younger voices. So we were told, of course, Bill Gates wrote a book about this friction-free capitalism, the free flow of ideas. We had Paul Mason. You remember Paul Mason, the supposedly left-wing journalist from the UK? He wrote a book called It's Kicking Off Everywhere, by which he was highlighting the importance of social media and communication in galvanizing the Arab Spring. And then it turns out that he's in bed with British intelligence, trying to get news outlets like the Gray Zone suppressed and censored. And whatever you make of those particular news outlets, the censorship industrial complex is not only alive and well, but becoming more and more powerful. Are there workarounds? Yes, but we are also dealing with a very real dynamic. The political scientist, not a radical by any stretch of the imagination, the political scientist Sheldon Woolen talked about inverted totalitarianism and the ways in which our consent can be manufactured through those very media, social media mechanisms. So let's say it's a double-edged sword.
Okay, one compliment. It happens here in Brazil that the younger generation is really not reading books anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That like paper book,
Yeah.
old-fashioned analog book, and it seems to me it's a problem.
It's a huge problem.
Okay.
It's a huge problem. There's some wonderful books on these questions, but there's an English language journalist, his name is Nicholas Carr, who published a book a few years ago called The Shallows, like the shallow end of the swimming pool, The Shallows. And it may well be in translation. It was a very popular book. And yes, indeed, our brains work differently with paper compared to electronics.
Okay.
You're
So
absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay, so it seems that alongside the climate problem, we have maybe a digital overload. If the youngers are not reading book like worldwide, then it could be a digital overload, maybe.
And we need to
That's-
understand this
that's-
as specifically a class project to manufacture consent and quiescence and passivity. I think that's why I would agree with your assessment. It is, in fact, a digital overload. It's not an accidental process. You see this all around the world to bombard you with information so that you never stop to think and ask the dangerous questions.
Okay, I'm happy it was a good point. I'm not happy with the conclusion. Okay.
Well, for every tendency, there's a counter tendency. So we need to be dialectical. Now, I have a suspicion that most of you are not particularly sympathetic to Marxism, but one of the great tools of Marxism is dialectics. And for every tendency, there is a counter tendency. For every determination, there is a negation. And that's an important tool. So for every moment of overload, there is a counter tendency of the emergence of consciousness. Whether the counter tendency prevails or not, that's a different question. That's a question of politics.
Amazing. Sad, over to you.
It's a very interesting point. I have so many questions. I've been reading your book. Thank you again for such an engaging lecture. And I haven't quite gotten through the book yet, but I'm absolutely sure that it is going to keep me up at night. So
You're
thank you
welcome.
for that. And I wanted to just ask you a little bit about what you mentioned in your lecture, that the climate crisis situation that we're in right now, you said that we are now in a situation of permanent war. And I was wondering if maybe you could help, because with the book, I'm not going to be able to sleep. And now with this in my head, it's going to make things worse. So I was wondering if maybe there was a way to maybe wrap my head around this, so that we could find, explore possible ideas that might be lying around, draw from them, and then, look for a way forward. I'm actually just reminded of a lecture from one of the other courses under this MDDI program. Ronald Sistek, he teaches us on distributed leadership, and he mentioned something that was very optimistic and hope instilling for me, that I held on to, is that there are always like weak signals in these larger systems, and if you can identify patterns and look for the weak signals, then there is a hope for maybe an intervention or making a change. So I guess my question is, can you identify possible weak signals in this environment that we are in, with climate crisis and permanent war?
Well, both are destabilizing for politics as usual. The politics as usual that we've known for the past 50 years, but also for the past 500 years. And so, as we know, historically, wars and their aftermaths have been moments of potential social revolution. World War I is brought to an end in the East by socialist revolution, in the West by proletarian revolt, the revolt of the German sailors and soldiers, which then destabilizes the whole of Central and Eastern Europe for a few years. A similar story is told after World War II. Of course, the triumph of the Chinese Red Army and the construction of socialism in China, which achieves the greatest and most massive, most rapid extension of life expectancy in human history, amongst other things, and is related to the worldwide national liberation revolt, from Vietnam to Algeria, to the Congo and everywhere else. And thence follows that, of course, another period of counter-revolutionary reaction, and so on and so forth. So moments of war are destabilizing to politics as usual. At the same time, wars, especially the pattern of war that the American empire, the greatest war machine ever in the history of anything, the kind of war that the US figured out how to do, involved doctrines of low-intensity conflict, of counterinsurgency, of capital-intensive war making, like the use of drones used worldwide, and proxy wars. So, for instance, using Saudi Arabia to kill, by the UN's estimate, a minimum of 500,000 Yemenis, and deliberately scuttling peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, who had a deal in place in March of 2022 for a settlement, deliberately extending those wars so that hundreds of thousands of people could be mowed up in an imperialist conflict. So there's that cliche from Gramsci, I don't like pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But I think what we can take away from that is that what I just said, for every tendency, there's a counter tendency. Climate change itself is and will continue to be profoundly destabilizing to business as usual. We don't see it yet because largely we have been, in the popular imagination, we've been blinded to the long history of popular revolt and unfavorable climate changes. The key mediators of this destabilization are, on the one hand, war. And these are what I call wars at the end of cheap nature. I've written an essay called Imperialism with and Without Cheap Nature on this very question, but also the exhaustion of the cheap food model. And the cheap food model is crucial for two reasons. One is that the reproduction of cheap labor power depends on cheap wage foods, on cheap industrial foods. The other moment is that political stability depends on cheap enough food. And we know this from one moment of social revolution from Paris in 1788 and 89, all the way to Petrograd in 1916 and 1917, to the Arab Spring revolts, that the destabilization of the cheap food regime leads to the destabilization of politics. And I think one of the things that academics need to stop worrying about is the stability of capitalism. We must cease to be terrified of the breakdown of the system. And that's my grounds for optimism, that historically, climate crises and the wars that follow from them are destabilizing to ruling class power.
Sorry, I'm reminded of this German word, Weltschmerz, which is world pain. And with the news dominated by these wars and the conflict that's going on in Ukraine as well as Israel-Palestine, it doesn't, what you're suggesting is that there's no hope on the horizon.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting exactly the opposite, that what we are seeing are, again, to quote Gramsci, the emergence of all manner of morbid symptoms that are not to be feared, but to be welcomed. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to be naive cheerleaders, but we need to understand that the unraveling of the world order, that is, of the world order constructed by the United States, specifically after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, that unipolar order is a sign of the ongoing intensification of capitalism's contradictions in the era of climate crisis. And so I think that you may interpret it as not optimistic, but I would say moments of very dramatic and severe and unfavorable climate change have always been moments of popular revolt. And what's different in the history of capitalism, it's different from the era of Malthus, and it's different from the era of the long, cold 17th century, is that there are no frontiers to which capital can move to fix its crises. And that's why we have an absolutely bloated, stagnant system of capital accumulation. You have $19 trillion of capital parked in zero or negative rate of return government securities. You have the ongoing descent of the rate of profit. And what is it that capital does when the economy stagnates? It moves to war. And this is a story that really goes back to the origins of monopoly capitalism, but especially to World War I. And after the 30 Years' War of 1914 to 45, we saw the decolonization and national liberation of the vast majority of humankind and the triumph of socialist revolutions, who, for all their contradictions, represented a signal contribution to human and indeed ecological well-being on a planetary scale.
So we're at a stage where we're not entirely sure what outcome this might have, but you're saying that we are at a point where the old formulas have clearly not have clearly shown that this environment is completely unique, and we don't know where we're going to go from here.
But I think we do know. I think that academics usually are afraid to name the system, and so they speak in terms of codes that feel more safe to them. They don't want to say socialism. They want to say degrowth. They want to say whatever, post-growth economy, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is that's a mistake. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because the transnational bourgeoisie, which is a real thing, the one oriented towards the trilateralist nodes of Japan and East Asia, North America, and Western Europe, that have been in the making now for 50 years,
have a real plan to deal with the climate crisis and to balance the costs of doing so on the backs of the bottom 80% of the world's population. So they have a deliberate plan to do something. And the left so far doesn't have a plan because we've all been talked into believing that socialist politics doesn't work. It's a failure. We can't ever do anything. And I would say that is a neoliberal ideological con job. That it's again based on my what I would recommend is let's look at the actual achievements of these actual existing socialist projects, not to cheerlead, but to draw the essential lessons. And one of the essential lessons is simply going back to Machiavelli's old aphorism about armed profits and unarmed profits. You can never sneak up or incrementally reform capitalism out of existence. They always know you're coming for them. And so we need intellectual clarity about the present conjuncture that identifies the real project. It's not capitalism, socialism, or barbarism. It's post-capitalism or socialism or some other multipolar order, which would also be post-capitalist.
Thank you, Jason. I don't know, Ginger, that you had raised your hand, and I think we can wrap it up a bit with Ginger, so we don't take you more time. Jason, we're making you talk a lot.
Oh, that's fine. I love to talk. More. Everyone should ask their questions.
Yeah. Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for this lecture, and I started reading your book as well, and being really fascinating. So in terms of like addressing climate change and capitalism, what do you think? What actually just this really probably just really open question. What do you think of like the carbon credit and the carbon market that has established nowadays in terms of like carbon trading even, and how that plays into the whole addressing climate change? Is that going in a better way or like a worse way?
A worse way for sure. I mean, what's the definition of insanity? Is using the same project, the same thinking over and over and over again. So, oh, well, now we don't have enough markets. But I would say this, that the neoclassical fantasy that everything could be turned into a market spells also the end of capitalism, because if everything is marketized, then nobody can make a profit. But essentially what we've seen ever since either the first Earth Day or the first Stockholm Conference on the UN environment is a series of proposals from the world's ruling classes and their scientific cadres to manage the climate crisis and to manage it through, for instance, better markets, better science. And this was very, very explicitly a program of planetary management. In fact, before they started to talk about planetary stewardship, which is all one of these Orwellian buzzwords, they said explicitly planetary management. And Paracelsus has written a wonderful book called How the United Nations Built Spaceship Earth that goes to this history from the very dawn of post-war American world hegemony. But I think we should always be skeptical of these so-called climate fixes that don't involve democracy. This is my problem with the Anthropocene, that Anthropocene advocates always say the same damn thing, that we need better science, we need to give control of the system over to the experts, that we need to cooperate, to quote Johan Rockström, the great climate scientist, we need to cooperate with the bankers and with the CEOs more than with the activists because there's no time. In other words, there is no alternative. And this is what environmentalism is telling us today. Now, that doesn't mean the environmental justice activists, it doesn't mean indigenous activists, it doesn't mean peasants and others who are insisting on a radical democratization as the road forward. But it means that we always need to understand that technical proposals to address the climate crisis are proposals for a reproduction of business and politics as usual. And I'll take more questions if people want to ask.
Anyone else? Or even you, Jason, if you want to bring a topic into the table.
No, this is fantastic. I mean, design is fundamental to, and I think some of the earlier questions about the utopian imagination, I'm 100,000% in favor of all manner of creative, dynamic thinking about how to organize the relations between humans and the web of life in an egalitarian way. And that has everything to do with design in every register, from the design of cities to buildings to everything. And I would say in that respect too, there is a rich and dynamic, and I'm sure you're very familiar with it all. I don't want to bring coal to Newcastle, but there's a rich and dynamic history of socialist efforts to reimagine cities and landscapes and design questions of every sort that were often quite ingenious. Now, they were also full of contradictions. That doesn't mean that, and I think this is how Tomas, well, it doesn't work. And I don't know how far you were taking that, but I just want to point out that that's an anti-communist observation. We can say that there were specific problematics in various socialist experiences, but the problem was not in democratizing the economy and getting control of various social formations out of, especially in the global south, the tight and intimate linkage between the bankers, the imperialists, and the oligarchs who ruled one country after another, and including Venezuela. I know you know this. A friend of mine says, well, building socialism is not as easy as it looks. And indeed, that's true, especially in Latin America, where the sensibility has been long before Elon Musk came along, we will coup whoever we want. And that's been coupled with a longer history of it became necessary to destroy the village in order to save it. And this is the mentality of the masters of mankind in the present moment, that they are willing to lay waste in a complete and totalizing fashion to anyone who dare oppose in a fundamental and strategic way the world accumulation of capital. And that's becoming a more intense experience as we move forward. So if you hear my reservations about a utopian imagination, it's only because we have to take all of that rich utopian thinking and join it to a specific reading of history and the possibilities of transition. And the transition will be, in one sense, in here and there, but it will not be in the model of a commune here and a city there and a country there. The capitalist class always knows when you're coming for their wealth and power, and they have a very, very specific, concrete playbook for how to respond to those threats.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing attached to this, and I think that it relates back to something that you were mentioning, and I click on me that you were saying that if you want to look for the on the real transformational technology that fueled, let's say, I don't know exactly which one you were referring, but let's say like a modern capitalism, no? Because basically we have like a more like a ancient capitalism or the history of Indonesia itself, no? And the creation of the Dutch East Indies companies and the first shareholder company to actually fund the trips and access to technology like shipping technology, etc., etc. And then you talk about the cotton machine as well, right? So we're seeing like iterations of technologies that are allowing, the dominant power to somehow to gain competitive advantages. And now you mentioned it as well. It's now having computer power, basically having like a huge rooms of servers that are able to capture the power of internet. And actually, one of the, we can comment on this as well. Like the internet itself is full of contradictions, right? Like it's a military project that becomes like the space for egalitarian society, and then later on, it's kind of like captured by this computing power fueled by corporations on Silicon Valley. So I want to test what we're like very naively we are thinking is that by democratizing the access to the means of production, which is something also that you mentioned, and I totally agree, is basically when you take the means of production from people, you basically make them dependent on anything else. And then that anything else needs to be controlled by someone, and then basically you are administering things. But what we're talking here is that through access to fabrication machines, to computer coding, like people share an open source way, to electronic boards that people can prototype things and make them at their own, in their own backyard. We find like a little bit of shine, at the end of the tunnel. And also it relates with something that you can do, because my criticism, I would say, like in the more social movements, like you need to achieve such a critical mass. And then that's when that's what you were saying, like that's when they see you coming. It's like when that critical mass is getting bigger, it's like that's like when it's easy to get the crowd and put it down. But I'm thinking more like a silent revolution. I don't know what you think about that, in which every single one, people is not screaming that loud, but it's just like working on this, sharing the code of how things are done, and then suddenly these things are unstoppable. Yeah. What do you think about that?
But historically, it doesn't work that way. And we've all heard many, many tales, some of which are apocryphal and some of which are very true, of quite extraordinary genius inventors and imaginers of different technological possibilities. Those are either crushed or appropriated, or the most narrow form of that. And so there's revolutions do not happen silently, and they do not happen, they do not catch people's unaware.
The only difference, no, sorry for interrupting, but the only difference here is like you can have networks of geniuses inventing things. So you can kill one, but you cannot kill all of them. You know what I'm saying? Like this is we're not talking about the genius in isolation in their corner. We're talking about that the networks of people building like this, in my opinion, like a more resilient way in making the quote unquote silent revolution.
I agree. I mean, I'm very much in favor of that, first of all. So I want to be clear that I'm not arguing against the idea of what you're saying. Where is it? I mean, historically, where is it?
That's the thing. That's it doesn't, because it doesn't exist in history, it doesn't mean that it won't exist. We're building.
The idea of networks of co-thinkers is not brand new, and
totally.
That, I mean, you can go to the technical and engineering societies of England in the 18th century, for instance.
Correct.
That this is not brand new. There's a wonderful book by a fellow, Jesse Goldstein. He calls it Planetary Improvement, and he did years of ethnography in what he calls the clean tech sector, that is sort of green energy, and he talked to inventors all the time, and he found universally the same thing, that either they would languish because the technology was not profitable, or there would be some entrepreneur to come along and take the narrowest possible application of that technology. This is indeed what we are seeing in capitalism at this moment, in which capitalism's definitive technological advances, which have to do with labor productivity, have absolutely stalled out. Now, there's algorithmic surveillance, computing infrastructures, but they haven't resolved the underlying crisis of capital accumulation in any way. And so there's a history here. Even the neoclassical economist Robert Solow, who won a Nobel Prize, said in 1987, computers show up everywhere except in the statistics. And so we have to, I think, I'm not arguing against what you're saying. I'm simply saying that for its revolutionary possibility to be valorized, it would need a revolutionary transition. Because capital doesn't want new technologies, it wants new profit-making opportunities.
So to sort of expand a little bit upon what you both have been talking about is to take a specific example of, say, 3D printing. I've observed, if you will, in the last 2 or 3 years, the general perception of 3D printing has been transformed by the fact that we've gone through a global pandemic and recognized, or at least started to look at, traditional manufacturing and the failures of not being able to deliver things like PPE, and suddenly just having like a little device that can print stuff, it becomes a tool for having some kind of a social engagement. And we've seen 3D printers being used to try and help frontline workers. And I'd like to think that this has changed the perception of what these devices are capable of. And I'd like to think that maybe this has given us pause to reassess how much we rely on traditional manufacturing tool chains. And with the Fab network, I think I've seen this echo in several projects, and I'm wondering if you see the same potential there, or are there things that we could maybe look at a little bit more closely to build up on?
Well, it's hard to answer because we have to answer it historically and look at why do certain inventions become widely used. And the shortest possible version of the answer is because they're profitable. There are technological innovations that require a long development time. And those are, like we just mentioned, the US war machines development of the internet. So 3D printing, who knows, maybe. We also want to be aware that over the past few years, this is the centerpiece of Dr. Evil himself, Klaus Schwab's program for a great reset in a fourth industrial revolution. And so far, that's been a lot of hype. What's not so much hype is that they would indeed like to put microchips in all of us and set up a world in which, to quote a Danish parliamentarian and associate of Schwab, you will own nothing and you'll love it. And so 3D printing, maybe, but so far there's a lot of hype, and you are on the cutting edge, so you may be seeing practical applications that are exciting and great.
It's not necessarily the technology, but how it's being used that I think has changed. We used to see this as, I mean, from the industrial standpoint, it was like, oh my God, it's going to help us reduce the cost of prototyping, and we're going to make things even cheaper than they already are, and lots of money. But what's happened is that these devices are in people's homes. And from that perspective, from the ground up, it looks very different, because the devices at home were being used to make cute, cuddly Yoda heads. And during the pandemic, people had the opportunity to stop and think that, okay, this thing that I've been using, which is cute and cuddly, can actually be purposeful and meaningful and can help the person next door or the person in my neighborhood clinic. And so the model or the mechanism of using these devices, I think, has offered a potential for change. And the work that I'm doing, I mean, I should point out, I live in Singapore, which is very much capitalistic. But I'm trying to get people to use 3D printing for making their own assistive devices, for persons with disabilities to make their own assistive devices. And I'm doing this work in a public library in Singapore. And the public library is made public by the Singapore taxpayer. But what I'm trying to do is to get people to access the means of production. And I didn't realize that until I heard you speak and read your book. So that's going to sit with me for quite a while.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, that's fantastic. And what you're highlighting is what we know about capitalism, that working people have a spirit of mutual aid. And the most generous people are working class people, broadly conceived. They're not the billionaires. They're not the upper levels of the professional managerial class. That there's this sense that we can begin to repurpose technologies and use them in different applications to help other people. And that's the spirit of mutual aid that has long been highlighted by communists and anarchists alike.
Wow, I love this last quote. I wrote it down. So Thank you, Jason. Honestly, I think we're on time. We don't want to steal you any more time. I don't know if any of you, both Toms, want to wrap it up also. But from my side, thank you for this amazing session. I will watch the recording again. There's a lot of information I was trying to grasp. So thank you once again from my side. And Tom D, Tom B, any comments?
No, thank you so much for such a meaningful conversation and discussion with all the class. And this is invaluable. Thanks a
Well,
lot.
thank you. It's been a
Thank you
treasure,
very much.
Tomas and Tomas.
Thank you
And
very much,
Josefina,
Jason.
thank you.
Thank you, Jason. We'll keep up talking by email to address the other details. And we hope
Very
to
good.
see you once again in another lecture, for sure.
Thank you. Be well and take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you.